on this very dynamic topic, and from their own perspectives will address regional security issues. The key speaker of today is Māris Riekstiņš, who is permanent representative of Latvia to NATO, and he will give introductory speech. Then we have discussants representing different countries, and I will start with Eka Saakashvili from Georgia, and she here represents Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Georgia, and she's in charge for European and Euro-Atlantic integration issues. Then the panel will be followed by Jānis Kažociņš, who is well known in Latvia, specialist in international security issues and cyber security issues, and at the moment he serves as advisor to Ministers of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Defense. And then we welcome also Professor Rainer Arnold, who is specialist in human rights issues, and particularly these days when we are so much discussing hard power issues, we tend to forget a little bit about the role of international law, and particularly we in the neighbor have, let's call them, few countries which are probably not very familiar with this instrument of international relations, since they have recently violated it several times. So welcome you too. The arrangement of today's panel is that those of you are presenting your speeches will be invited to replace Māris, so there will be some kind of rotation of players. So we are an ice hockey country, so yes, permanent rotation, at least for those who are speaking. I will invite Māris to provide a little bit longer insight, then approximately 7-10 minutes for the next speakers, and then the floor will be open for discussions and open exchange of views. So without any hesitation, I give floor to our ambassador to NATO, Māris Riekstiņš. Please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Ozoliņa. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the conference and, of course, University of Latvia for inviting me to address this roundtable discussion on a very important topic related to the overall security challenges, and perhaps also specific attention should be paid to security challenges for our region. It's always good to be back at Alma Mater. I have to admit that being a student of this university 25 years ago, I feel slightly nervous to sit behind the desk of Senate room. At that time, I was not a single time invited to this room, even not to sit here at this desk. Since I was asked to deliver a keynote speech, with your permission, I will stick to the script, and then later on during the exchange of views and discussion, of course, I will be in a more flexible modus operandi. As many of you know, the intellectual patron of this conference, Jean Monnet, was regarded by many as the chief architect of European unity. He is said to have had a hatred of war and a passion for peace. A passion guided by his lifetime throughout 2 world wars. Since his time, a generation has grown up in Europe, among them current students, also current students of this university, born in a post-Cold War era, who consider security as granted. However, it appears that we need to revert to discussion about security in Europe in such a way as none of us expected or believed would be required in 21st century. Russia's aggression in Ukraine has brought in new reality and challenged the whole European security architecture as we knew it according to the United Nations Charter or the Helsinki Final Act of 1975. Let's set the record straight of what has happened. NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen rightly called Russia's illegal aggression against Ukraine the most serious security crisis and gravest security threat since the end of Cold War. We do indeed live in a different world than it was a couple of months ago. It is the first instance since the end of World War II when the borders of a European state are being redrawn by use of military force, intimidation, and subversion. And this has been done by the Russian Federation, one of the permanent members of United Nations Security Council, which under UN Charter has primary responsibility for maintenance of international peace and security. Again, to quote NATO Secretary General, we've seen Russia rip off the international rule book. Russia has challenged not only European or regional security, but the whole international order by brutally violating its bilateral agreements and in cold blood showing total ignorance of its international commitments. This fundamental principle to observe in good faith obligations under international law and commitment to refrain from the threat of use or use of force against each other or any other state are now at stake. The demonstration of Russia's military capabilities in 2008 in Georgia's breakaway regions Abkhazia and South Ossetia was considered by many as an isolated incident. The 2014 events in Ukraine regretfully prove this to be a trend and a consistent policy exercised by our big European neighbor. The 2010 military doctrine of Russian Federation classifies NATO actions, including striving to give NATO forces global functions and moving NATO infrastructure closer to Russia's borders, as one of the external dangers to the Russian Federation. Many perceive these only as declaratory words, while Russia, on the contrary, has political readiness and intent to use military capabilities for geopolitical gains. And Russia also has demonstrated that she is ready to assume all political risks related to it. During last month's developments in Ukraine, Russia's hard power posture has been accompanied by a remarkable propaganda push by Moscow, leveling a series of accusations against NATO and international community, making baseless attacks on the legitimacy of the Ukrainian interim authorities, and pushing the boundaries with its own version of events. One must admit, though, that Russia's de facto declaration of information war to the Western community is nothing new, but rather a well-established trend of disseminating half-truth and falsifications. Russian soft power is cooked in a destructive sauce, one of blackmailing and discouragement, leaving the positive side of soft power aimed at encouragement and promotion unexploited. However, this hardcore soft power being such an integral part of the overall operation has led to several references of a hybrid war with ambiguous warfare, where upper hand can be gained by different means, even without performing an overt military operation. I'm glad to note that developing NATO Strategic Communication Center of Excellence in Latvia currently is devoting its attention to the analysis of the crisis in Ukraine from the point of view of strategic communications, and that the first public conference on this subject will take place in Riga next week. Russia's actions in Ukraine, of course, triggered almost unanimous condemnation from the international community. Each international organization has its own area of competence, as well as a range of members. Some, like United Nations and OSCE, include Russia, thus complicated the related decision-making ability, especially in the United Nations Security Council, where Russia has its veto rights. Nevertheless, the UN's General Assembly resolution on territorial integrity of Ukraine, calling upon states not to recognize changes in status of Crimea, received an overwhelming majority of votes in favor, while Russia's side was chosen only by a handful of countries such as North Korea, Venezuela, and Syria. Let me now introduce a couple of points with regard to NATO's activities in this context. And here I would like to distinguish the following parallel tracks of response to the crisis in Ukraine. First, this is about suspension of relations with Russia, leaving only a channel for ambassadorial dialogue open. Despite Russian allegations that NATO isolates it, for many years, NATO has used every opportunity to improve and further develop relations with Russia, to cooperate and not to confront. Allies had offered Russia a more privileged partnership within the NATO-Russia Council than to anybody else around the world. Allies kept their pledges while Russia threatened its neighbors and used force against them. It has not respected the territorial integrity and sovereignty of other countries. All the alliance has done is in full compliance with NATO-Russia Founding Act, fully proportionate and transparent. The recent meeting of NATO-Russia Council ambassadors on 2nd of June took place upon the request of the Russian ambassador to NATO. And during that meeting, allies conveyed to Russia our firm support to Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence, and the message that we do not and will not recognize Russia's armed annexation of Crimea, and we strongly support Ukraine's right to choose its own path for the future. We called on Russia to withdraw its troops and to stop the flow of arms and fighters into Ukraine. Second track is related to reassurance measures of NATO collective defense guarantees to NATO allies along its eastern borders. Short-term reassurance measures that have been taken to date comprise bolstered air policing, AWACS flights, reinforced maritime patrols in the Baltic and East Mediterranean seas, and land reinforcements in Poland and the Baltic states. During the NATO defense ministers' meeting held just a week ago, allies agreed to continue and further reinforce NATO's reassurance measures. Readiness action plan is to be developed by the NATO summit in Wales in September this year, which in our opinion should include measures aimed to enhance NATO's response force level of responsiveness and NATO's intelligence and awareness, to preposition equipment and supplies, to focus NATO exercises even more on specific defense challenges. As many know, President Obama just recently announced his intention to seek support from US Congress to appropriate a $1 billion US reassurance fund that would allow for increased rotation of US forces to Europe, improvements in basing and infrastructure, the possible forward positioning of equipment, and enhanced training and exercises, notably on the territory of the newer allies. Third track of response is assistance to Ukraine and practical measures to enhance cooperation with Ukraine. These measures are focused on advisory and defense capacity building efforts in view of the lessons learned from the current crisis and its implications for regional and allied security, including, for example, in the area of logistics and standardization, as well as strategic communications. At the same time, preserving also the strong emphasis on democratic development, engagement with civic society, promotion of human rights and freedoms, good governance, and democratic control over the armed forces and security sectors, as set out already in the annual national program for Ukraine. Allies have expressed their full support to the newly elected Ukrainian president, Petro Poroshenko, and stand ready for dialogue and cooperation, hoping this is the momentum not to be missed in Ukraine's European path. In addition, NATO is also working on measures of enhanced cooperation with other European partners, recognizing the vulnerabilities that countries like Moldova, Georgia face in the region. Each of the countries has its own aspirations, and the guiding principle in NATO cooperation with them is demand-driven. Although the crisis in Ukraine is not over, we can already draw certain lessons learned in terms of challenges in the region. Among them, underfunded military budgets in a high number of NATO countries, energy security, and the urgent need for energy diversification, but above all, it is the challenge of being in the gray zone, especially with a big neighbor like Russia at your borders. Whether we want it or not, but Russia forces to make a geopolitical choice following the principle of zero-sum game. We've seen during last years the Eastern partners trying to balance their foreign policy, introducing concepts of non-block status or multi-vector policy, which creates ambiguity. Both NATO and the European Union follow a different approach than Russia, leaving it up to the countries themselves to decide of their alliances or non-alliances. Latvia's choice made more than a decade ago was to introduce clarity on our determination and ambition for the Euro-Atlantic path. In light of the NATO response and the multiple measures taken, I would like to emphasize the fundamental difference between a NATO member state like Latvia and a partner country, I have to say valuable partner country, like Ukraine. And here the dividing line is Article 5 of Washington Treaty, which states that an armed attack against one NATO ally shall be considered an attack against the whole alliance. 10 years after our full-fledged membership in NATO, we more than ever before feel the importance and necessity of this collective defense shield. One can notice that recent developments in Ukraine have contributed to more active debate on potential NATO membership in Sweden and Finland, also very close regional partners. We consider it as a positive trend because we would like to see these countries part of the alliance one day. But of course, this is up to the people of those countries to decide. At the end of the day, it all comes down to a simple truth, and here I refer again to Secretary General of NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, that shared security is better than solitary insecurity, and it's cheaper too. However, security still comes at certain cost, and we have to contribute our share to that, with some exceptions, but the general rule proves to be that the countries with the least defense expenditure are also the ones most vulnerable. I have to say here, also being ambassador of Latvia to NATO, that the pledge, commitment made by the government of Latvia to increase our defense spendings to 2% of the GDP in the period till 2020 is important one, important commitment. It has been noticed by our allies. It has been noticed by the current leadership of NATO alliance, and I think it's extremely important that we stick to this commitment as a crucial contribution to our own security and our sign of solidarity to the alliance and the Euro-Atlantic security as a whole. To sum up, I'd like to say that the current situation is not an isolated episode, but marks a long-term concern. The ball is in Russia's court to renew cooperation and dialogue with NATO or the rest of the international community. There will be no business as usual till Russia withdraws its troops and gives back Crimea to Ukrainian people. This is for some time to come. In the meantime, NATO will do its own job in terms of reinforced collective defense, which will be a major agenda item for the upcoming Wales summit in September. Some say Russia's actions in Crimea and eastern Ukraine have been a wake-up call to Ukraine, to NATO, to the international community as a whole. Indeed, Jean Monnet once phrased it well: people only accept change when they are faced with necessity, and only recognize necessity when a crisis is upon them. Thank you so much.